Today on The Growing Philosopher. This week we continue our discussion on the nature of philosophy. We will examine the relevance of philosophy for a cultural context today and the ways in which philosophy relates to modern scientific theory. But first, Patrick will introduce the topic of the relationship between philosophy and the transcendental virtues, truth, goodness, and beauty, on this week's edition of The Growing Philosopher.
So philosophy begins in a habit, but that habit is not fully formed philosophy. A habit of questioning or wondering. But then it realizes itself in a systematic or logical relation between questions,
Yes.
right? Under a rule of logic that then embodies itself in a series of answers.
Yes.
And that is the science of philosophy. And so the science of philosophy can be, articulated in terms of, what some people call systematic philosophy. It's what I study in school right now.
Yep.
But then how would we call philosophy like an art? How does art relate to philosophy, you think? Would we say it's an art, or would we say that art is a form? I think I would be, just to lay my cards on the table, would be more accustomed to say that the art of philosophy is contained in philosophical discourse, which is like a necessary outflow or a quality of philosophical thinking, but it's not part of the essence of philosophical thinking and philosophical science.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that any relationship between philosophy and art would have to be in the actual doing of it.
That's right.
Which is...
Yeah, the creation of philosophy, right.
Yeah, well, and not just...
Philosophical treatises, I mean.
Yeah, rhetoric is a big component here, because I would say philosophy is a science. It's a science which assumes virtuous habits of the will and the intellect. The very fact that an individual will look at a tree or anything, even evil, and have this demand for an answer, that itself is a virtuous disposition, because he's seeking the end which is proper to him. The intellect is there to know.
That's a good point.
So it assumes virtuous habits of the will and virtuous habits of the intellect, and then results in a science, a body of knowledge, which is objective and distinct from the individual, because I'm a realist, not an idealist. So
Right.
art then would
Good
be
man.
when I try to communicate that to another individual, because I do have to be persuasive. Even Aristotle would recognize that the person who will submit to arguments and submit to reason already has a share in virtue, because they understand that reason is something which they are to submit to as a human being.
That's right.
But then even then, he'll still say that I still need to present that in a persuasive manner. I can't just say, oh, you should believe this because blah, 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 blah. Well, if I poorly present my position, why should anyone believe me?
Right.
If I'm lazy, why should they?
And this is one of our critiques of modernity, right? It's that it's simply the result of bad philosophy. Okay, so I think we're getting at some interesting distinctions here, right? The habit is not philosophy fully formed, but it's a necessary precondition to the creation of the science of philosophy, which is the interrelation of questions and answers in the form of a worldview, right? But then, if you answer those questions rightly, according to right reason, you necessarily come to a definition of man that is more than just abstract notions or what we would call like analytic philosophy, but is more accustomed to maybe something like Plato's dialogues, or like something that is beautiful at the same time that it is rational, right?
Yeah.
And however much we might disagree with Plato, but you have to admit that Plato can be looked at from a philosophical perspective or a literary perspective.
Yeah.
Right? You can look at him just purely in terms of literature, which I did in school, and just notice it for the beauty of its own sake. But I think
an excellent dialogue.
I think in that regard, our own philosophical system as me being very sympathetic to Aristotelianism and you espousing Aristotelianism, would say philosophy's natural end is to produce itself in a beautiful art form, right? Philosophical discourse is
to pursue excellence.
Is the natural end of a man who's viewing himself and actualizing himself completely, which is why at the Reformed philosopher we care about things like literature and music and the whole spectrum of man actualizing himself.
And even when you were talking about how philosophy intends to contain some type of beauty, when it's done, the assumption that beauty is somehow not related to what's true is itself a modern assumption.
That's right.
Which does not get a free pass. We get to doubt that.
Yeah. So flesh that out. The transcendentals is what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking about Plato's ideal of truth, beauty, and goodness. Aristotle kind of is like, no, the forms and their actual existence in a separated reality, no. But in Book 12 of Metaphysics, I could be wrong on that, he does espouse a separated good. This idea of a transcendent good, which actually does exist, which grounds the goodness of other particular goods.
Aristotle says that?
In metaphysics.
I haven't read that part.
Yeah, in Nicomachean, he seems to be very much against it. But my point here is that what's so helpful about particularly the Greeks, and then also in some ways a lot of the Christian philosophers, is this assumption that reality has to cohere. And not just cohere in superficial terms, but in core realities. Like at the bottom of it, it does have to cohere.
That's right.
There has to be an order which pervades the entirety of it. Otherwise, I can't make sense of it. It's not intelligible.
So we could say something like, I think the Proverbs, it says, when it's talking about like a woman, it says, a beautiful woman without discretion is like a gold ring in a pig's snout, right? It's got the form of beauty without the truth of the goodness, right?
Exactly.
And so, and I think to your point, what Thomas and what more of a classical understanding of philosophy would assume and would posit and would argue for is that truth to be full includes the beautiful, and beautiful to be full has to include the true and the good, right? And that these things are not separated realities, but they are distinguished, but always interrelated, which ultimately to play towards Christian philosophy a little bit, right? To make our move next to the contemplation of the divine. This is why Christian philosophy is so important, because it grounds ultimately the inherent reality of experience, which is the transcendentals, right? The true, the good, and the beautiful, interrelated, which is ultimately grounded, we would argue, in the Trinity. Right?
Exactly.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one in essence, three in person, distinguished but by no means separated, mysterious yet by all means coherent, right? So that reality, which I think is partially indubitable in any ultimate sense, that the transcendentals, you have to have all three in order to have a full philosophy, ultimately has to have a grounding which we believe would ultimately be Christian. Now the argument there is full, and you know, a lot of people make some logical problems, but that's our answer.
What about natural science? Like right now, in the world of academia, in the world of popular knowledge, as it were, science is at the forefront to the point where it's been deemed scientism. How does philosophy relate to that? I mean, you go back and you read the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and they're delving into natural philosophy. But nowadays, you don't really have natural philosophers anymore. You lost those about 150 years ago. So how does philosophy relate to natural science today?
By answering its inadequacies. Natural science can't look at the biomechanical structure of my body and tell me how I ought to live. All it can do is observe that there's a biomechanical structure and attempt to describe it. It's inherently descriptive.
Can't move from is to ought.
Well, not with natural science.
Not with natural science, right?
I'm not going to go with Hume all the way.
Yeah,
but
good point.
Natural science, its own methodology restricts it. Because it's predicated upon what? Primary thesis formulation, experimentation, observation, thesis reformulation, continual experimentation, and then continual observation.
And the communal acceptance or denial, right?
Yes.
And this is a scientific method you're espousing.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you describe that, you can't say to me what the nature of reality is, because the scientific method assumes an answer to that, which is that all I can see, smell, taste, and touch, and that's all I can verify empirically. Therefore, that's all that must be.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and
nobody wants to talk about that though in scientism. They act like it's just necessarily objective. It's like no.
There's a subjective component.
It's just to you. Right?
Yeah, well, and even beyond that, the method restricts itself insofar as it presents an answer, or at least in the way it's done today, it presents an answer in asking the question, which is, well, materialism.
This is all that is, right?
Yeah, all that it can be.
Which is an assumption, not a justified conclusion.
Exactly. It's a circular argument.
That's
because you're asking a question, but the means by which you're going to ask that question itself restrict there to being only one possible answer.
So let me repeat that point just real quickly, because I think it's absolutely important. Science, natural sciences, is done today by scientism and atheists and people who are espousing this, is circular, and what we mean by that is that it assumes a conclusion at the outset without rational justification.
Exactly.
Right? There's no reason. Okay,
No.
and its assumption is the material world is all that is because it's all that I can see with my eyes, and that this conclusion just frankly is philosophically bankrupt. It doesn't follow.
They're just assuming David Hume.
Right.
And you see that, what's so funny is despite the fact that they're assuming David Hume's empiricism, his is-ought distinction, fundamentally comes back and punches them in the face. Because when they tell me how to live, the moment they open their mouth, they've just made a fool of themselves.
Right. Because where do you get from evolutionary theory to me loving my neighbor?
Well,
right? or being tolerant or anything,
yeah,
right?
well, the interpretation of what science observes isn't proper to science.
No.
Not, at least not natural science.
That's right.
It's proper to something else. It's proper to a critical science which examines interrelationships between concepts and then moral dispositions and all of these things. It asks questions, particular questions, which assume universal answers. What does this sound like, people? It's not natural science, it's philosophy.
You're making a distinction between the fact and interpretation. Can you get into more of that, like what the distinctions between those are for our users? Because I think that concept is absolutely crucial to understanding philosophy and its relation to natural science.
So you have natural science observing anything. I mean, anything from the particles of water interacting with one another to the way your brain functions, the way your heart beats. Because of its method of observation, it describes that. But in that description, it's not an interpretation. It's still unprocessed data. It's just saying, this is what I've observed.
That's right.
Well, the question is, well, what does that mean?
What does it mean for me? What's its importance? What's the import, right?
Yeah, what does it actually mean in itself?
That would be interpretation.
That's interpretation, exactly. What does it mean in itself? What does it mean for me?
That's right.
What does it mean about the order of things? It ends up asking metaphysical questions, which science can't answer.
That's right.
It ends up asking ethical questions like, is it really right to operate on a certain person's brain?
Right.
Is this procedure ethical?
Right.
How can you answer that question by the method itself? You can't.
And you can't.
You need something higher than it.
You need something higher to critique it, to
Exactly.
order it, to justify it. So whenever I was explaining this, I teach a Bible study, and I did an apologetics, kind of course. And I taught them the distinction between interpretation and fact. And I said, imagine, you and an atheist are walking side by side. They're Christians, right? And you go and you see a dead cat on the road. Both of you are observing the same dead cat, and you have a level of common ground in seeing the same dead cat. You can recognize that it's a dead cat, the form of a dead cat that you've seen over and over again. But once you get into the question of where ultimately did this cat come from and what ultimately is its purpose, the unbeliever will say, well, that dead cat is the result of a million biological processes and its failure to triumph in the pursuit of survival, and its goal is meaninglessness because it's going to just die and go in the ground. The Christian looks at that cat and says it was ultimately a creation of God that was upheld by God's providence, and its death is the result of the fall, right? The curse of the fall, and that its ultimate purpose is in some way or shape or form, either in and of itself or in the ultimate purpose of the cat to glorify God, right? So you have the fact, and it functions as a point of contact. We never want to deny that. That's why we're realists. We're not idealists. We don't say that facts don't to some extent speak at least some information to both parties regardless of their worldview, right? That's where we deny presuppositionalism and Van Tillianism, right?
Yes.
But it's not to deny the whole of that interpretation is necessary, and I think that's the point you're making.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. The scientific method is that, basically speaking, you have to empirically verify your claim. Natural science says that it's the only science whereby you can attain knowledge.
Right, and that's an interesting point, all right? So philosophers are not disparaging of science, right?
No,
right.
we need it.
Aristotle had, they called it natural philosophy under age, right?
Yeah.
The distinction, though, is the same distinction that we made earlier with modernity. Modernity disparaged. They threw all these into different compartments, and they did not relate all these different sciences or aspects of the one science of building a knowledge, building a system, to each other. So that natural philosophy really is part of your broader philosophy.
Yeah,
right?
Philosophy of nature is necessary.
Right, exactly. And so there's, in my opinion, like I'm looking at the basic scientific, method, and I'm like, I don't have a problem with this as long as it's based on, sound philosophical presuppositions that can justify it.
Yeah, and if it's not,
right.
I can doubt it all day.
Exactly. So then we would say the distinction between natural science and scientism is that scientism makes natural science all that there is.
You'll like this one, Patrick.
Okay, go for it.
Scientism is dogmatism.
Scientism is dogmatism, right? And Aaron and I were talking about that yesterday. One of the keys of dogmatism is the absolutization of one perspective as though it's the whole. Yeah. Right.
Scientism, by definition, is
dogmatism. It is a form of religion.
Yes,
that seeks to control. Right, to use Marxian language, it's an opiate. Right.
Yeah,
it's a claim. To take the postmodernists, it's a claim to power so they can control other people and shame them. Right. I have the scientific view of the world. The world was created 30,000 years ago for evolutionary, or it just came into being, and it's absolutely absurd. Right?
It's exactly like Richard Dawkins' foolish presentation of himself.
Which is the most. I mean, I heard a person talking about Dawkins and all those guys, and one of the critiques by actually an atheist philosopher is he's like, have you read the last 50 years of philosophy? Like, and how objectivity is not so objective as you want to make it out to be in Dawkins' sense. I mean, as though the scientific method can give you all of objectivity, and that you're not that you're not bringing in assumptions.
Yeah, no.
So,
I mean,
I don't mean that there's no objectivity. Obviously, realism, but
there has to be objectivity. But yeah, and not only when you were talking about opiate, something you used to control. I mean, think about the militant atheistic culture, which I'm sure even atheists who want to present themselves as nuanced have to be against necessarily if they're to do philosophy properly.
Right.
Is that this is it's a disposition of the crowd, of the mob,
right,
being imposed upon the individual to restrict his freedom of thought and expression of that thought.
That's right.
I mean, it's very much mental slavery. It's very cultish.
That's right.
So you're talking about an axiomatic
acceptance.
Yeah.
On the basis of shame and praise and honor.
Exactly.
Right? You're in or you're out.
It's manipulation.
Because you accept evolutionary theory or not, or all these things uncritically.
And if you don't, you're you're an idiot.
You're an idiot. And that was what my first post on the reformphilosopher.com was about. Because I watched a TED Talk, and it was just this tribalism and the modus, the way that she got to put people on her side or against her side, had no appeal to rationality, and every appeal to shame and honor. You're either with me or you're against me, and if you're with me, and that's how scientism differs from natural science. Yeah, Aristotle did natural science, did lots of it. The Christian philosophers were not against natural science. What we're against is scientism as a religion, as a dogmatic system of belief, which is a faith system. It's a faith-based system, and it's a leap of faith-based system because there's no reason to believe it. Because it can't justify itself on its own claims, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I believe science because science told me to. It's like, come on, man.
It's like that's stupid.
You're a joke.
Yeah. And according to an Aristotelian perspective, natural science is all the more necessary.
That's right.
Because any knowledge necessarily results from sense experience.
That's right.
And abstraction from it.
That's right. And you're an embodied creature. You're part of this thing, man. You're in this world.
Natural science.
Yeah.
But you need natural science to be in its proper place.
That's right.
Perform its proper function.
That's right.
And relate properly to the other sciences.
That's right.
That's what you need. The moment it tries to be the end-all of everything, then you're left with a bunch of nonsense, unanswered questions. It's not existentially satisfying. It's not intellectually satisfying. And it's culturally pathetic.
And when we say it just leads to pragmatism, I mean, which is one of the three philosophies that the Reformed philosopher was created to combat, right?
Absolutely.
Dogmatism, pragmatism, postmodernism.
Yep.
All right. It nullifies its postmodernism by its claimed objectivity, right? So scientism wants to say we're purely objective, and what it adheres to in distinction is nothing but dogmatism and pragmatism.
Yeah, it's very modernist.
So and what I mean by its pragmatism is that you see a development within after modernity, you see the rise of positivism. Right? Positivism is just the belief that anything that can't be justified by the senses is meaningless. That's the positive maxim.
But that can't be justified.
Problem with that is that the rule can't be justified by sense experience.
You're talking about what's called the verification principle.
Verification principle, right? The verification principle of meaning. And then later on, you have people who are like, okay, well that's crap, So they just go into pragmatism of saying, well, we don't care, and we're going to construct entire philosophy and value theory around what works, right?
Yeah.
And that's the American culture today. That's the American landscape. The proof is in the pudding. The only thing that matters is what I can justify consequentially, and I have no need to reflect.
Yeah.
Well, my next question then is philosophy as it's been institutionalized academically, is that actual philosophy?
See, this is one of those really tricky questions because on the one hand, as someone who wants to be an academic philosopher, I don't want to disparage that because I have seen and have experienced good come out of that. But on the other hand, there is very much a sense of corruption in the academy. I do not want to negate that fact. You run across it all the time. It's there. It's not about your merit. It's about who you know. It's about this. It's about that. It's not about what actually should matter. And it is a corrupt system in some ways. So, on the one hand, no. The answer is no. And that's the side of me that wants to just burn down stuff like this. Is you have people who are coming into doing academic philosophy, and they're shoving down the existential question of why does all this matter? Why does this?
Right.
Why should I know philosophy? What does my life mean? Does it have meaning? The questions that philosophy originates in to answer, certain types of academic philosophy provide a distraction from. McIntyre talks about this in the essay I mentioned previously, where he talks about how certain types of philosophy within the academic sphere just operate as a distraction, as a way to not think about what actually matters in their existence. And that's the way it is, many ways, and at many times. The way it ought to be, in my opinion, is that academically institutionalized philosophy should function in such a way as to seek the answers to those questions in a more thorough, deeper, and profound way for the betterment of the society for which it's doing that.
That's right.
See, a philosopher isn't any different from any common person. He's just a human being. He's not a king. Plato's wrong. He doesn't have extra rights. He doesn't have extra privileges.
That's right.
He's just a man. He's just a man doing what he man ought. That's it. But a person who wants to become a vocationally philosopher, the way it should work is they should be self-conscious in the fact that they're doing this to provide answers to people who are living in despair and depression, who are having to face ethical dilemmas that are sometimes even beyond a comprehension. Like, you look at these problems and you're like, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't.
Right.
They almost seem not to have an answer. The academic philosopher should be the professional in the sense of the man who spends his life attempting to answer those questions for people who, quite frankly, do not have the time.
That's right.
But now it doesn't work that way because of pragmatism. Now it's what works. And because of pragmatism, philosophy is dying. Philosophy has turned on upon itself and has become to eat its own arm, as it were, in the American and North American and European academic institutionalized context, which is a great discouragement, and I think it's something that we should work to combat in any way possible. Absolutely.
So I think I agree with Mike, right? So institutionalized academic philosophy is not inherently a bad thing. It's actually inherently a good thing because it's something that prioritizes people to be given a living wage in order to do philosophy full time, which should function as a benefit to society at large, right? Now, one of the main, it used to, right? It did. One of the main problems with this now is that we've moved so far from the questioning spirit to the systematizing spirit, right? We said philosophy begins in a question and realizes itself in an answer. Now the only thing that philosophy does is it didactically teaches you answers at an institutional level, if we're to broaden that, right? You are to toe the party line. You are to be a pragmatist. You are to be an Aristotelian. You are to be all these things without first opening someone up to the philosophic spirit so that they can come to resolute conclusions and bring something, their own particular perspective to the whole. And so I would say our answer to the current American institutionalized academy and the way that philosophy is done in the analytic tradition and the pragmatist tradition is not complete destruction, right? Not complete destruction, but reformation, right? We need a reformation in academic philosophy because we want to maintain the good, which is that people get paid full-time, a living wage to do philosophy, which benefits society as a whole. But when these institutionalized philosophers, like they are in our day, are being paid to primarily, and I'm not talking about all of them, there are certain other philosophers, being paid primarily to espouse analytic philosophy, which only focuses on the rational relationship between words and things like that, and just, and I don't want to crassly represent them, but analytic philosophy and pragmatist philosophy, they've sold their birthright at the outset, and that's the problem. It's that they're just towing party lines and giving didactic things, and they're being utilized by a society primarily in a Marxist sense in order to control a series of people and make them toe the party lines and not to do real philosophy. So the reformation would have to be to create a system which would go back and would prioritize more the question and the honest answer and less just towing the party line of tradition.
I mean, what we're talking about here is people attempting to do philosophy without themselves possessing the requisite virtuous dispositions and habits.
And being a philosopher in any significant sense, right?
Yeah. I mean, so it removes them. They're only philosophers nominally, these people that we're describing. But this is why, when I said earlier that philosophy assumes virtuous habits of the intellect and the will, because of its nature, you have to be able to balance between the question and the answer. You have to be able to balance between all of these social pressures, all of political changes. You have to actually pursue and value truth above your friends, above political parties. Truth has to be what we value most, like Aristotle says. Even though he goes against Plato, he says we need to value truth more than our friends, even though both are dear to us. And if you have someone who's not possession of the moral virtues and intellectual virtues, and you give them a position of influence, as it is in a teaching position at any university, you have them then incapable of maintaining not just the philosophical spirit, but the good of other people in view.
That's right.
This is why McIntyre says in his select essays, Ethics and Politics, that the moral condition of an academic is inherently important. And our educational system doesn't value that at all. They say, no, the moral disposition of a moral philosopher doesn't matter.
That's right.
Someone could teach moral philosophy and then go have an affair with someone.
It's all abstract.
But that's absurd.
It's absurd.
It's nonsense. And it's not going to work. It doesn't work. So it fails on its own pragmatic evaluation. But then at the same time, it fails on a more deeper level where it's hypocritical. It makes a joke of truth. And it destroys people's lives.
That's right. That's right. I think one way to kind of explain what me and Mike are talking about to our users who are more probably familiar with theology than they are philosophy is to show an analogy between, Christ and the Pharisees, right? And the way that institutionalized philosophy can turn into a form of Phariseeism, right? If you remember, what makes a Pharisee is that on the outward side they appear righteous, they hold dogmatically to what has been given down, and they are, in the center of society. But what distinguishes Jesus and what he's doing from them is that he's more concerned with the soul, the heart, which then impacts the outward appearance and the outward way that someone lives, and action, right? He's not opposed to action, outwardness, but that it comes from the soul. And so what Mike and I are talking about is there's a problem in academic philosophy, which is that people become so institutionalized and so towing of the party line that it becomes nothing more than an outward show. The way that you get the job is to make sure you get your PhD from Oxford, toe the party line, say it right, and to just, essentially not be a philosopher in heart, but to be a philosopher in outward appearance. You can quote Socrates better than any other person. You can quote all these people, but you do not, in substance, adhere to a philosophical spirit, which is not just outright rebellion. It's just outright honesty. Right? It's being willing to go where logic and being take you, regardless of what people think about it, and being willing to live according to that. Right? Socrates took this to such an extent that he wasn't even willing to he never made a living, kind of a thing.
Yeah,
right? He was willing to be
did.
poor. Marx a very similar thing. Right? Marx takes his philosophical spirit, even though we heavily disagree with Marx in a couple places. He was willing to take his philosophy wherever it would lead him. This is the philosophic spirit, right? Not just towing the party line, not reducing all philosophical questions down to like a couple questions about how language works, or a couple questions about trying to make a mathematical language. Again, we're hitting hard on modernity, the analytic philosophers, and scientism today, and it's because it's anti-philosophy.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. If you would like to take a look at some of the books and philosophers that we've mentioned in this podcast, we've provided links to those works on the podcast page at thereformedphilosopher.com. Just simply go to our website and click on the podcast tab, and in the description of this episode we'll have those links posted. And once again, thank you for joining us. We'll continue our discussion next week here on The Growing Philosopher.